Hello ladies and gentlemen. Recently there has been talk about units if they deserve a Novaflare or not. This discussion is surely not because a Novaflare was announced or dreamed or anything like that, wink wink. And while it would be interesting to discuss who would be getting a Novaflare, at least that's what my audience thinks for some reason, I've already talked too much about it on this channel, and picking on easy targets like Zhao Cho is honestly kinda just cheating. So I thought of doing this a bit differently. Instead of talking about who could possibly get a Novaflare, or talking about dreams of who is getting a Novaflare, I will instead discuss only the most divisive units who the community is pretty split if they deserve a Novaflare or not, and if they really deserve it in my own opinion. This won't just be saying how good the unit is, since tldr is a team building game. The individual is only one part of the puzzle, while the team can heavily impact their viability just the same. We're mostly taking the unit in consideration with their teams and their current position in the meta as a result. So with that out of the way, let's get on to the video. First, let's talk about the Herta. I was initially shocked of seeing a post about Herta getting a Novaflare, but then again it was on Twitter. She does need a buff though, and it's important to dissect why it shouldn't come in the form of a Novaflare as the first unit that I will discuss. Herta's main issue, and it always has been since her release, is her over-reliance on target count for everything in her kit. While many would argue that her restriction for erudition is equally crippling, that by itself wasn't an issue due to the simple fact that double erudition is extremely good for what Herta was specializing in, that being AoE content. Herta can very easily crush AoE under her heal, and that's why there was so much AoE content in the early days of 3.x. Then the target counts dropped and HP increased at the latter half of 3.x, which made running a Herta a bit more of a struggle. To save a DPS that's facing this issue, you release new teammate, and Herta's destined teammate was apparently Anaxa. As much as Anaxa is a good unit as a main DPS, and you'll never see me insult him in any way, his capability as a sub DPS has always been kinda meh. He provided the most buffs to Herta as a sub DPS in the stiffest sense of the word, but if you remove the implants in his kit, Anaxa is genuinely worse than Topaz's buffs to their respective main DPS, that being Fei Xiao for Topaz and that being Herta for Anaxa, with similar attack frequency problems that made Anaxa a side grade to Little Herta in pure fiction. I think a great heuristic that someone told me about if an emanator has a teammate problem is this. If you copy the emanator with the exact same kit and you put them with the original unit in the same exact team, is it any better than what the emanator has now? In Fei Xiao's case, not really because of Ashvale. In Akron's case, no, because Mortenok's blade exists now. In Herta's case, yes. Big Herta has higher buffs to the team than what Anaxa gives for her. That's how dire the situation is. Even if you take this heuristic away, just compare Anaxa to a real sub DPS like Evernight and Ashvale, and there is a very clear problem that Anaxa simply just doesn't have the numbers to match them. And Herta is not a grossly overpowered unit where her sub DPS has to be weak to compensate for it. She is clearly much weaker than Castris and Evernight, so there's no excuse for it. It also doesn't help that many team upgrades for old teams in 3.x were specifically to counter bad matchups, and Herta got on the short end of the straw. Castris had Cyrene at Evernight's E1 to massively fix her single target issues. Firefly notoriously had Dahlia, and High Sealants got Novaflared Kafka to reduce the need of enemy turns, which hurt DOT for a long time. Herta didn't get a support where her low target performance was fixed. She got a sub DPS that would have preferred Herta being kicked out of the team to do the stage instead. If they finally pull the trigger on an Argenti Novaflare, we can only hope that Argenti can give buffs to Herta that at this point need to outmatch Ashvale, and some mechanics to make low target Herta actually usable without Eidolon. But that's all just hope and dreams for the moment. So in my opinion, Herta needs a buff, but Herta does not need a Novaflare on herself. She might need a Novaflare in terms of Argenti getting it, but not her own kit. She just really needs a real teammate instead of just changing her kit around. Next is Fugue. I was also surprised to see this one, but the arguments for it have kinda convinced me that yeah, she kinda does need it. Fugue is a unit that basically only exists for exo toughness. Much of Fugue's kit's interesting nature is locked behind Eidolon's otherwise. Her skill buff is such a tiny amount of break effect that unless your Fugue is E1, which gives it weakness break efficiency, it doesn't really matter who you put it on with break teams nowadays. Her ult does next to nothing unless she's E2, in which case it's a DDD proc, which is really strong. Her E4 is a rare multiplier while her base is pretty underwhelming, and E6 spreads her skill buff to everyone to remove her single target buffing weakness. If you look at her kit with a modern lens in raw numbers and the amount of utility it has at E0, this is objectively kind of a bad kit. But taken into the context of what team she is put in, it's pretty unlikely that Fugue needs a buff. While Fugue is a one-trick pony, the team that she has relies on this one trick so much, and the team itself is so absurdly broken that even if you rightfully think Fugue's kit kinda sucks, her team does not need her to be buffed to be good. Are people willing to take another break merchant Novaflare after Firefly? I'm not really sure. But Fugue is a very simple one niche unit that is designed for a game that constantly keeps adding more and more features to newer kit. This is called feature creeping, by the way. I wouldn't be opposed to a Fugue buff myself, by the way, but that's mostly to balance out Butil and Rappa, but it's pretty naive to think they'll focus on those two when Firefly is right there. If I were to speak completely objectively, out of every other party member in the break team, I think Ron May should be updated more since her Eidolons just do not make sense for break for now. For whatever Fugue's flaws are, you gotta admit her Eidolons are actually the best part of her kit, but just because Ron May needs it more doesn't mean Fugue needs it less. Fugue's kit is being carried by her archetype despite being a support, and hopefully Fugue does get a Novaflare, preferably after the 6 other archetypes that are much worse than Break actually get updated themselves. Next is Lingsha, another break merchant. I know that I said this was going to be a most controversial list, but I wanted to talk about Lingsha because even I don't know what to do with her, and I think it's very interesting to talk about her. Lingsha is kind of a balancing nightmare. While nearly everyone agrees that Lingsha does need a Novaflare, it is unclear what would actually be the best for what role her kit will take. Her first problem is her very shaky sustain. While you can buff Lingsha to be a more serviceable healer, how far can you really push that? She shouldn't heal any more than Luocha and Hyacin because that's just ridiculous. But putting that aside, the issue is her position as a break unit means running a sustain is already kinda unnecessary by design. Even with how strong Lingsha's healing potentially could be with a buff, it would just be unnecessary for the team that she's trying to sell. And sometimes it's even counterintuitive due to Lingsha needing counters, which needs her to be at low HP. The amount of defensive properties Break has makes a Break sustain just kinda awkward to be in. But of course, this is only an issue because sustainless is such a huge gap compared to Lingsha being on the team. So her second issue is lack of buff. But the problem with that is if you buff Lingsha's buffs a little too much, what even is the point of a unit like Ron May or Fugue? You want to sell as many break units as possible, and making a sustain indistinguishable from a support probably doesn't help with a team that historically are sustainless merchant. An example of this is Hyacin being so good that there isn't any point doing sustainless with mono rem unless you just want to flex, I guess. Alternatively, you can fix the other problem that Lingsha has. Her damage is just too low, but if you buff Lingsha's damage a little too high, huohuo will snap her neck for trying to step up to Firefly, and the amount of safety in comparison will hurt everyone else. There's also another alternative. What if Lingsha was a jack of all trades that is versatile for any team comp with worse sustain instead of trying to pigeonhole her into break? She has high attack frequency that can be for Asheville teams or Herta teams, and she can even be somewhat of a driver for Jade team. While that is pretty interesting, this is honkaistarrail, which means interesting mechanics are kinda just a fever dream. So what can you do with Lingsha? In my personal opinion, finding a good middle ground with all of her issues, giving her buffing so that sustainless isn't such a big gap, but she's not completely 100% the best option, buff her personal damage just a bit and make her at least somewhat usable as a flexible healer. But the simplest answer that they will probably do is to just implement currency wars. The truth is that it's hard to predict what they really want from Lingsha. Is she getting more support buffs? Does she want to be a worse main DPS at the cost of safety? In the first place, does she want to keep being a sustain for a team that doesn't care about it in the first place? Or is it just better for her to just be versatile and not care about break anymore? Whatever it is, Lingsha does need a Novaflare, and one of these issues has to be fixed somehow. I swear to God it has to. Lastly, and from what I observed is actually the most controversial, is Sunday. Before going into this topic, it is important to note that there is a distinction between a unit that needs a Novaflare and who deserves it more. As exampled earlier, Fugue does need a Novaflare because her kit is just really bad, but her position as a break merchant means there are far more deserving to go first. Sunday is kinda no different, and I think the controversy of a Sunday Novaflare comes from this distinction. Sunday is a hyper carry buffer that does almost everything a hyper carry wants: double turns, energy, and generally useful single target buffs. However, Sunday is a unit that has had a pretty straightforward design when released, but a confusing design once everything unfolded. A lot of Sunday's kit focuses around summons and interacting with them, but outside of the HPT, who is mostly optional, and Aglaya, the game somehow completely dodged him being relevant in remembrance teams. It is quite interesting that instead of that, Sunday was for units like Maidi and Anoxa, who did not hold a summon at all until Daniel Permasor Turai. And once they did get a summon with Daniel Permasor Turai, Sunday ran on borrowed time to be replaced by Cyrene almost immediately. This is now often referenced as a way to be skeptical of units with clear design biases like Yao Guang, because something that seems obvious might eventually not be true anyway because of the precedent of what happened to Sunday. Then you look at Sunday's Eidolons. While Tribi at E0 has fallen off pretty badly, at least her E1 makes her a genuinely valuable unit. Sunday has no Eidolons that do this. His E1 is deceptively weak, his E2 is hard to make use of even for Archer, his E4 doesn't open up new breakpoints for him unless his Sig is literally S5, and his E6 is just okay. Compare this to Novaflare Sparkle, who dunks on Sunday's E6 with just her E2. In the current day, Sunday just doesn't stand a chance to a unit that was given out for free. There really is no other way around it except just giving him a Novaflare at this point. Again, Sunday's Novaflare shouldn't be first in line when DPSs like Dr. Ratio exist, but it doesn't mean that Sunday shouldn't have one at all. His kit itself does have a clear idea, and he's still usable, but the numbers just haven't caught up very well to the point that nearly all of his teams are replaced by Cyrene or Sparkle, even ones with logical DPS options like Saber, which should not be happening. If you look at a unit like Bronya even, Bronya did have stronger buffs than Sunday, but very bad uptime that made Sunday generally better. If we're comparing a 1.x unit like a while earlier with Anoxa and Topaz, you know just something isn't right. So it all seems very simple then. At the root of it all, Sunday just doesn't have the numbers to catch up. He can give 80% damage dealt and 20% crit rate with around 72% crit damage, but now sub DPSs are reaching that level for the entire team. Sure, it's more specific, but it's way stronger. Sparkle's Novaflare had the right idea in tackling rare multipliers instead of what she had, gaining res pen and vulnerability instead of damage percent. Sunday desperately needs the same buffs, making him stronger while not sabotaging his nature as a generic hyper carry buffer for energy team. They should also do something about his party members' buff duration, since it tends to get pretty hairy with DPSs like Saber. It wouldn't really be imbalanced to give an extra turn instead of a 100% action advance to make this happen. It's also good to note that Sunday's E1 is likely not going to increase its number, since his strongest DPS named Finon already caps defense shred at high investment. Oh, speaking of which, his Eidolons desperately need work too. Overall, Sunday is still better off than some cooked DPSs like Dr. Ratio, but he does need his numbers fixed, and a Novaflare saving him would be very healthy, I think. Anyway, that's all. In your opinion, who do you think is the most controversial Novaflare unit? Cypher would have been on this list until I asked around and realized it was way more common to think that Cypher needs a Novaflare, so I decided not to to add her, to be honest. But yeah, again, that's it. I'll see y'all later. Like, share, do the algorithm stuff, and bye-bye, everybody. I'll see you tomorrow with piloting streams. And then we're gonna have 4.3 drop, I guess, and I'll pull blade.